Hello, and welcome. Today we're exploring one of the most significant movements in African history, African nationalism. This episode is designed specifically for advanced-level history students, providing the depth and detail you need for your studies while making these complex ideas accessible and engaging. Let's begin by setting the stage for our discussion. To understand African nationalism, we need to first grasp the context that gave birth to it. Imagine yourself in Africa during the late 19th century. The Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885 has just concluded, and European powers have divided the continent among themselves like pieces of a cake, drawing borders with rulers and pencils, paying no attention to existing African political structures, ethnic groups, or cultural boundaries. These arbitrary divisions would create challenges that continue to shape African politics today. Colonial rule established itself through three main channels, and understanding these is crucial for your examinations. First came political control, where colonial powers either dismantled traditional African political structures entirely or reduced them to mere tools of colonial administration. Take the French approach of direct rule, for instance. In their territories, they essentially erased existing political systems, replacing them with French administrative structures. The British, on the other hand, preferred indirect rule, keeping traditional leaders in place but stripping them of real power. Think of it as a puppet show. The traditional leaders remained visible, but colonial administrators pulled the strings. The second channel was economic exploitation. Colonial economies weren't designed to benefit Africa. They were created to serve European interests. Imagine a factory where all the raw materials flow out at low prices, and all the finished products flow back in at high prices. That's essentially what colonial powers did to Africa. They turned entire territories into suppliers of cheap raw materials and captive markets for expensive European goods. This created what economists call a dependent economy, one that couldn't function independently because it was designed to be dependent on Europe. The third channel was cultural domination, and this might have been the most insidious of all. Colonial powers didn't just want to control African territories and resources. They wanted to control African minds. They attempted to convince Africans that European culture was superior, that African traditions were primitive and needed to be abandoned. They imposed their languages, religions, and cultural values, trying to create what they called civilized Africans, essentially, Africans who would think and act like Europeans. Now, this brings us to African nationalism itself. For your A-level exams, you need to understand that this wasn't simply a reaction against colonialism, it was a comprehensive vision for transformation. Think of it as a three-dimensional revolution that operated simultaneously on political, economic, and cultural levels. Let me explain each dimension in detail. The political dimension was perhaps the most visible. It focused on achieving self-governance, the right of African peoples to determine their own political systems. When Kwame Nkrumah declared, "We prefer self-government with danger to servitude in tranquility," he wasn't just making a rousing speech. He was expressing a fundamental principle, that the risks of self-rule were preferable to the certainties of colonial domination. The economic dimension was equally crucial. African nationalists understood that political independence would be meaningless without economic control. Imagine gaining the right to govern your house but having someone else control your bank account. That's essentially what nationalists wanted to avoid. Take Tanzania's Ujamaa policy under Julius Nyerere as an example. It wasn't just an economic program. It was an attempt to create an African model of development that would free Tanzania from economic dependence on former colonial powers. The cultural dimension of African nationalism is particularly fascinating. Colonial powers had spent decades telling Africans that their cultures were backward, their traditions primitive, their languages inadequate for modern thought. African nationalism turned this narrative on its head. In Senegal, for example, Léopold Sédar Senghor developed the concept of negritude, celebrating tea. He unique values and characteristics of African culture. This wasn't just about preserving traditional dances or festivals. It was about asserting the fundamental dignity and worth of African civilization. Now, Let's examine how these ideas transformed into action through political organizations. The story of the African National Congress, ANC, in South Africa perfectly illustrates how nationalist movements evolved in response to colonial intransigence. When the ANC was founded in 1912, its leaders wore suits and ties, wrote polite petitions, and believed they could achieve change through reasonable dialogue with colonial authorities. By the 1960s, these same leaders had concluded that armed resistance was their only remaining option. What happened in between tells us much about both colonial rule and African nationalism. Picture this. It's 1912, and a group of educated African leaders meets in Bloemfontein. They're optimistic, believing that if they can just show the British the injustice of the system, change will come. They write petitions, organize peaceful protests, and try to work within the system. But year after year, decade after decade, instead of progress, they see their people's rights being steadily eroded. The 1948 election brings the National Party to power, and apartheid intensifies racial segregation. By 1960, when peaceful protesters are gunned down at Sharpeville, the ANC's leadership concludes that nonviolent resistance alone cannot succeed. This transformation wasn't unique to South Africa. Across the continent, nationalist movements had to adapt their strategies to local conditions and colonial responses. In Kenya, the Kenya African National Union, KANU, emerged in a context where land alienation had created deep grievances among the African population. The fertile highlands had been taken for European settlement, forcing many Africans onto marginal lands. KANU had to balance multiple challenges, uniting different ethnic groups, addressing land redistribution, and managing the transition to independence. The leadership of Jomo Kenyatta illustrates the complex role of educated elites in nationalist movements. Kenyatta had studied in London, where he connected with other African nationalist leaders and developed his political ideas. But he also maintained strong ties to his Kikuyu cultural heritage. His book, Facing Mount Kenya, demonstrated how African leaders could bridge traditional and modern worlds. For your examinations, this ability to analyze how leaders navigated between tradition and modernity is crucial. Let's move to West Africa, where Ghana's Convention People's Party, CPP, under Kwame Nkrumah demonstrated yet another approach to nationalism. Nkrumah understood something fundamental: that independence for one African territory wouldn't be enough. The independence of Ghana is meaningless, he declared, unless it is linked up with the total liberation of Africa. This wasn't just rhetoric. It was a recognition that in an interconnected world, true independence required continental unity. Nkrumah's CPP developed a strategy they called positive action. This combined nonviolent resistance with political negotiation, mass mobilization with tactical flexibility. Think about this approach like a chess game where you're using multiple pieces in coordination. The CPP organized strikes and boycotts while simultaneously participating in constitutional talks. They built mass support among workers and market women while developing plans for industrialization and modernization. When Ghana achieved independence in 1957, it became a model and inspiration for other nationalist movements. The CPP showed that independence was possible, that African leaders could successfully challenge colonial power. But they also demonstrated the challenges that would come with independence. How do you build a modern economy while maintaining cultural authenticity? How do you unite different ethnic groups into a single nation? These questions would become crucial challenges for post-independence Africa. Now, let's examine how ordinary people participated in these movements, because this is a crucial point that often appears in examinations. African nationalism wasn't just about famous leaders making speeches. It was about market women boycotting European goods, dock workers refusing to load ships, students organizing protests, and farmers resisting unfair taxation. Consider the Aba women's riots of 1929 in Nigeria. The colonial authorities had decided to impose new taxes on women market traders, while simultaneously undermining their traditional political rights. The women didn't just accept this, they organized massive protests that forced the colonial government to reconsider its policies. This event shows us several important things: the role of women in resistance, the importance of economic issues in sparking protest, and the effectiveness of organized mass action. Let's delve deeper into the internal factors that shaped African nationalism, because understanding these will be crucial for your examinations. Colonial oppression manifested in ways that touched every aspect of African life, and each manifestation contributed to the growth of nationalist consciousness. Take the issue of land alienation, for instance. This wasn't simply about Europeans taking physical territory, though that was devastating enough. In many African societies, land held deep spiritual and cultural significance. When colonial authorities seized ancestral lands for European settlers, they weren't just creating economic hardship, they were disrupting the very foundation of social and spiritual life. In Kenya's White Highlands, entire communities were forced from lands their families had lived on for generations. Imagine having not just your home, but your entire way of life taken from you. This created a profound sense of dispossession that would fuel nationalist sentiment. The system of forced labor was equally significant in shaping African resistance. Colonial authorities used various methods to coerce Africans into working for European enterprises. Sometimes this was direct forced labor, as in the Belgian Congo's rubber plantations, where failure to meet quotas could result in brutal punishment. In other cases, it was more indirect, heavy taxation that forced people to seek wage labor to pay their taxes. Think about how this system affected families and communities. Men often had to leave their homes for months at a time to work on distant plantations or in mines. This disrupted family life, agricultural cycles, and social structures. Speaking of taxation, let me tell you about how colonial tax policies inadvertently contributed to nationalist consciousness. Colonial authorities insisted on taxes being paid in cash, not in kind as had been traditional in many areas. This might seem like a small administrative detail, but its implications were profound. It forced people who had lived primarily through subsistence farming and traditional exchange into the colonial money economy. When the Bambatha Rebellion broke out in Zululand in 1906, it was triggered by a new poll tax, but it represented resistance to the entire colonial system. One of the most fascinating aspects of this period was the role of education in fostering nationalist consciousness. Colonial authorities established schools primarily to train African clerks and junior officials needed to run the colonial administration. But these schools had unintended consequences. Take Akamota College in Ghana, for example. It was meant to produce Africans who would help maintain colonial rule, but instead, it became a breeding ground for nationalist leaders. The same was true of Fort Hare in South Africa and Makerere in Uganda. The story of how educated Africans turned their colonial education against the colonial system is particularly interesting. When Kwame Nkrumah studied in the United States and Britain, he didn't just learn about Western political systems. He learned about successful resistance movements, about political organization, about how to challenge power effectively. The same was true for Julius Nyerere, whose training as a teacher gave him skills he would later use to explain nationalist ideas to the masses. Now, let's examine an often overlooked but crucial aspect of African nationalism, the role of independent churches. These institutions emerged as Africans began to question why Christianity, which preached equality before God, could coexist with colonial racial discrimination. Independent churches provided spaces where Africans could worship without European supervision, but they became much more than that. They were places where people could discuss political issues, organize community action, and maintain cultural practices that colonial authorities disapproved of. Think about how these churches operated. When colonial authorities banned politic meetings, people could still gather for worship. When colonial schools taught that African culture was primitive, these churches integrated African spiritual traditions with Christian practice, showing that African culture had value and dignity. In your examinations, you might be asked to analyze how religious institutions contributed to nationalism. This is a perfect example of how social institutions could serve multiple purposes in the nationalist struggle. The role of traditional leaders in nationalism presents us with some fascinating complexities. Colonial powers had tried to co-opt traditional leaders through the system of indirect rule, but many of these leaders found ways to resist while appearing to cooperate. Consider the case of the Asante Ene, the king of the Asante people in Ghana. While officially working within the colonial system, he maintained his people's cultural identity and resistance to colonial domination. Some traditional leaders became symbols of earlier resistance to colonialism. The memory of Shaka Zulu's military resistance to European expansion inspired later generations of nationalists in South Africa. Even when traditional resistance had failed militarily, it provided powerful symbols and inspiration for 20th-century nationalist movements. This shows us something important. Nationalism drew strength not just from new ideas and organizations, but from historical memory and cultural pride. Now let's explore how global events transformed African nationalism, because this understanding is essential for your examinations. World War II, in particular, created changes that would shake the foundations of colonial rule. Imagine you're an African soldier in 1939. You've been called to fight for the British or French Empire against Nazi Germany. You travel thousands of miles from home, fight alongside European soldiers, and risk your life for the cause of freedom and democracy. But here's the crucial question that many African soldiers began to ask. If they were good enough to die for freedom in Europe, why weren't they good enough to have freedom in their own lands? The war changed African soldiers in profound ways. Fighting alongside Europeans, they discovered something important. European soldiers weren't superhuman or inherently superior, as colonial propaganda had claimed. They were just men, with the same fears and weaknesses as anyone else. This realization helped break the psychological barriers that colonialism had created. When these soldiers returned home, they brought with them not just new military skills, but new confidence and a broader worldview that would fuel nationalist movements. But the war's impact went beyond the experiences of individual soldiers. It fundamentally weakened European colonial powers. Britain and France emerged from the war physically and economically exhausted. Their empires, which had once seemed invincible, now showed clear signs of vulnerability. Moreover, the war's anti-fascist ideology, with its emphasis on freedom and self-determination, provided powerful arguments that African nationalists could use. After all, how could Britain and France claim to have fought for freedom in Europe while denying it to their colonial subjects? The international context of the post-war world created new opportunities for African nationalism. The United Nations, established in 1945, included self-determination as one of its core principles. This meant that African nationalists now had an international forum where they could raise their grievances. When Kwame Nkrumah spoke at the UN, he wasn't just speaking to his fellow Africans, he was addressing the world, and the world was listening. The achievement of Indian independence in 1947 sent shockwaves through the colonial world. Here was proof that a colonized people could successfully challenge British imperial power through organized resistance. Indian leaders like Jawaharlal Nehru actively supported African nationalism, sharing their experiences and providing moral and material support. When you're studying this period, think about how the success of one anti-colonial movement inspired and influenced others. The Cold War added another fascinating dimension to African nationalism. Both the United States and the Soviet Union saw newly independent African nations as potential allies in their global competition. This created opportunities for nationalist movements to gain support, but it also created complications. Let me give you an example that perfectly illustrates this: the Congo crisis of 1960 to 1965. When the Congo gained independence from Belgium in 1960, it immediately became a battleground in the Cold War. The country's first democratically elected leader, Patrice Lumumba, tried to maintain independence from both Cold War blocs. But when he sought Soviet help after the Belgian intervention, the United States became alarmed. The tragic result was Lumumba's assassination and years of instability. This shows us how Cold War politics could both help and hinder African nationalism. The Pan-African movement provided crucial international support for nationalist struggles. Organizations in the United States, the Caribbean, and Europe helped publicize colonial abuses and raised funds for nationalist movements. The Fifth Pan-African Congress in Manchester in 1945 was particularly significant. For the first time, the Congress explicitly called for African independence and brought together future leaders like Kwame Nkrumah, Jomo Kenyatta, and others who would later lead their nations to independence. Think about how these international connections worked in practice. When African students studied abroad, they met others who shared their experiences of colonialism. They read about successful resistance movements in other parts of the world. They developed networks that would later provide support for independence struggles. The ideas and strategies they encountered abroad were then adapted to African conditions when these students returned home. As we approach the end of our discussion, let's consider how African nationalism continues to shape our world today. The achievement of independence was not the end of the story. In many ways, it was just the beginning. The challenges that faced newly independent African nations were enormous, and understanding these challenges helps us grasp both the successes and limitations of nationalist movements. Consider the issue of borders. When African nations gained independence, they inherited boundaries drawn by European powers at the Berlin Conference. These borders often divided ethnic groups between different countries while forcing historically separate peoples to live together in single nations. In Nigeria, for example, the British had combined the Muslim-dominated North with the largely Christian South, creating tensions that would later lead to civil war. This helps us understand why national unity has been such a persistent challenge in post-colonial Africa. The economic legacy of colonialism proved equally challenging. Colonial economies had been designed to extract resources and export them to Europe. Changing this system was like trying to rebuild a house while still living in it. Newly independent nations needed to develop new industries, train their own experts, and create economic systems that would benefit their own people. Some leaders, like Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, attempted rapid industrialization. Others, like Julius Nyerere in Tanzania, tried to develop alternative economic models based on African traditions. The successes and failures of these different approaches continue to influence economic debates in Africa today. Let me share a concrete example that illustrates these challenges. In 1960, the Democratic Republic of Congo gained independence from Belgium. The country had vast mineral wealth, but after decades of colonial rule, it had only a handful of college graduates. The colonial system had deliberately limited education to create a small class of clerks while preventing the emergence of an educated elite that might challenge colonial power. When independence came, the new nation faced the immense task of building a modern state without the trained personnel it needed. This example shows us how colonial policies continued to affect African nations long after formal independence. Now, let's talk about how to approach these complex issues in your examinations. When you're asked to analyze African nationalism, remember that examiners are looking for several key elements in your answers. First, they want to see that you understand the movement's multiple dimensions: political, economic, and cultural. Second, they're looking for your ability to connect different factors and explain how they influenced each other. Let me show you how to build a strong analytical response. Suppose you're asked to evaluate the role of World War II in the development of African nationalism. A basic answer might simply state that the war weakened colonial powers. A better answer would explain how African soldiers' experiences changed their perceptions of European power. An excellent answer would connect these military experiences to broader social changes, showing how returning soldiers influenced their communities and how their new skills contributed to nationalist organizations. Here's another example of how to develop your analysis. When discussing the role of educated elites in nationalist movements, don't just list what they did. Think about the complexities of their position. They had been educated in colonial schools, often spoke European languages, and were familiar with European political ideas. Yet they became leaders of movements opposing colonial rule. How did they bridge the gap between their Western education and African traditions? How did they maintain connections with the masses while using their elite education to challenge colonial power? Let's conclude by reflecting on why studying African nationalism matters today. The movement's legacy lives on in contemporary debates about African unity, economic development, and cultural identity. When African leaders today discuss continental cooperation through the African Union, they're building on ideas that nationalist leaders like Nkrumah promoted. When countries grapple with questions of national identity and ethnic diversity, they're dealing with issues that nationalist movements first confronted. Understanding African nationalism helps us grasp not just what happened in the past, but why many current situations exist as they do. It shows us how people can overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles through unity and determination. Perhaps most importantly, it reminds us that history is not just about memorizing dates and events. It's about understanding how the past shapes our present and influences our future. Before we end, let me share some final study tips. When preparing for your examinations, don't just memorize facts. Try to understand connections between events. Ask yourself questions like, why did nationalist movements take different forms in different regions? How did local conditions interact with global influences? What made some approaches more successful than others? These kinds of analytical questions will help you develop the deep understanding that examiners are looking for. Remember, African nationalism wasn't just a historical event. It was a transformation that reshaped an entire continent and influenced independence movements around the world. As you continue your studies, keep thinking about how these historical processes continue to influence our world today. Thank you for joining me on this exploration of concept of African nationalism. Next time, we'll examine the Italo-Ethiopian crisis of 1935. Until then, keep questioning, keep analyzing, and keep learning. If you found this video helpful, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps the channel and keeps you updated with more educational content. Hit the notification bell so you never miss a lesson. Keep learning, and see you in the next video. Disclosure. This content was produced with the assistance of AI tools, with human review and editing to ensure accuracy.